Hey guys, this is BBZ with a new set of ICM sims. So the big blind, which we are most concerned with, has 7 big blinds. In position has 20 big blinds. There are a range of stacks also at the table, and one stack in particular has 4 big blinds, which will be quite constraining to the big blind strategy. Okay. The big blind is up against a 15.69% raise first in at the root of our sim. That's right here. So this is the raise first in strategy for the in position player. Again, 2.1x, 15.69%. The big blind strategy is very tight. So the big blind is folding against a 2.1x 81.23% of the time. That's quite high. You can see hands as strong as ace 9 with 7 big blinds, ace 9 just folding before the flop. Suited aces just folding before the flop. Again, that 4 big blind stack is quite constraining. The 3-bet strategy has been shifted dramatically from what a chippy V strategy would look like. Lots of pairs are being flatted, hands as strong as 7s. Aces is being flatted. Again, aces doesn't really give up much going into the flop, so that makes a lot of sense. It's a good way to defend. The pre-flop strategy at 7 big blinds, you can basically felt all flops. And so we do have a more narrow 3-bet strategy, with all of these offsuit ace highs either being folded, ace 10 being called. So it's a much tighter strategy. You can see an aversion to flipping. Okay, so when the big blind does a 3-bet jam, okay, when the big blind does 3-bet jam, the raise first in player has a 30% fold, and this has a very significant impact because a lot of players, a lot of real time opponents in game will not have any fold percentage at all versus the 3-bet, and it's important that when we've evaluated that and when we did that exercise, a lot of the pre-flop 3-bets shift to calls. The range doesn't change so dramatically in terms of the total hands played over here. Okay, but a lot of these more marginal 3-bets do shift towards being flatted. Okay, and so again, the raise first in strategy against the 7 big blind stack is actually to raise fold hands as strong as ace 8 suited versus a 7 big blind re-steal, and that's because the big blind just needs to be so tight with that 4 big blind very constraining stack at the table. Okay, so I think very interesting. We can see just how much equity is required to call it off for in position versus the 3-bet here. So we can look at this here and we can see that hands like king jack on king 9 suited are folds, and looking at the equity for in position, it looks like we're stacking off with around 36% equity, considering king queen is a felt and king 10 suited is a felt. So it looks like we're looking for around 36% equity to stick it in, and 34% is just not enough. So with that, we can move on to our second sim. So all inputs are identical. Okay. The only difference is that the raise first in is now been shifted to 20%. So the payout structure is identical. The ICM adjusted tree, the ICM stack distribution, is identical. But the raise first in frequency has shifted from 15.69% to 20%. Okay. This is a 20% 2.1x. You can see the big blind fold has shifted from 81% to 75%. So the big blind's able to play more hands. That makes sense. The raise first in strategy has weakened. So more hands are being introduced. You can see that the 3-bet strategy has gotten wider, 7s and 6s. You can see ace 10 being pure 3-bet instead of being flatted. So the 3-bet strategy has gotten a little bit weaker. It's gotten wider. Again, I think this is rational. I think this makes sense. This is what we would expect to see. But again, still a market departure from what you would expect to see in chippy V. So this is, I think, very strong implications for the way that people are playing in game at the moment. And when the big blind does execute the 3-bet strategy, what does the in position player defend? So the in position player sticks to that 28% fold, so around 30%. Again, I think this is very important. We do see an impact if the opener is incapable of raise folding versus a 7 big blind stack. We see implications for what you 3-bet. It just gets more narrow. You see a conversion from some of the more marginal 3-bets towards flats. And we can see also what how much equity is required for in position to call it off. So we can see ace 8 suited and ace 10 offsuit is the bottom of the range. And if we look at the equity required, it looks like it's sticking to right around 36%. This looks like too much, obviously. So it's a bad bottom. But ace 8 suited looks like it's hovering right around 36%. Maybe we could look at like 10-9 suited as well. And 10-9 suited is also right around 36%. So it looks like we need right around 36%. There's just such a sharp difference between ace-10 offsuit and ace-9 offsuit. That's why they bifurcate that way. So again, we will now move to our final sim, okay, which takes place versus a 25% RFI. So again, all of the inputs are identical. The exception versus this 2.1x is the raise first in, and that's just been shifted to this range here, which is a 25% RFI. And getting straight into it, we can see that the fold continues to drop. Again, that makes sense. The weaker the range, the more we get to play. You can see that still there is a very significant fold with offsuit combos from the big blind, and certainly still folding some suited hands. So again, this is a very weak raise first in, at 25%. You're still folding a tremendously wide range versus what's very close to a min raise. You can see that the big blind is now 3-betting ace-9 offsuit, ace-8 suited, king-queen offsuit. But you can still see this hesitance to flip, right? If you're just going to run it, even with 7 big blinds, it's really not a thing. I mean, you really not want to flat hands like deuces, threes, fours. Some of like, ace-2 suited, some of these like hands that are going to have negligible equity advantages versus a range, they don't jam, okay? So, and then the response versus the shove from the opener, okay, is a 25% fold. And I think that this is worth mentioning just because the fold is actually dropping, even though the range is getting weaker. One might associate a weaker range with calling less often, and the stronger range with being able to call more often. But the difference is really in what the big blind counter strategy looks like. And what's happening is the big blind is 3-betting a weaker range because it's up against a weaker range. And as a result of that, a lot of these hands are actually very similar in terms of their equity profile. So there's really not a huge difference between Jack-10 suited and a Queen-9 suited, for example, potentially. And as a result, a lot of these hand classes start to be able to call as the pre-flop 3-bet gets weaker. So with that, we can see just what type of equity represents the floor. We can look at maybe King-9 and Queen-9 suited specifically. And we can see that it's still hovering right around 36%. So I think that hopefully with all three of these examples, 15, 20, and 25% raise first in examples that we've looked at, you can start to appreciate that maybe a 36% equity is what you need to call it off. And against a 7 big blind stack, that is a significant premium to the odds you're getting. So you can't just look at the odds you're getting and make a direct odds-based call. You need an equity premium or a risk premium to call this off. So hopefully this was very interesting, and thanks very much for listening. I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.